Mark had spent the better part of a decade as the quiet background noise in Elena's high-frequency life. As a senior developer, his world was composed of logic gates and encrypted layers, clean, predictable, and invisible. To Elena, a charismatic pharmaceutical rep who thrived on the adrenaline of a closing sale, Mark's stability had become indistinguishable from boredom. She viewed his routine as a lack of ambition, unaware that the same mind that kept their home running also kept the most complex fintech systems in the city secure. The anniversary dinner was supposed to be a milestone, but the air between them was thick with a finality that Mark had sensed weeks prior. Throughout the meal, Elena's attention remained tethered to her phone, her thumbs dancing across the glass with a frantic energy that had nothing to do with work. She finally set the device down, screen up for a split second, long enough for a notification from regional project lead to flash a heart emoji before she flipped it over. The shift happened when she slid a heavy, cream-colored envelope across the table. It contained a divorce petition, drafted with a clinical coldness that matched her expression. She spoke of growth and different orbits, explaining that her career was moving into a stratosphere where a simple programmer could not follow. She laid out her terms with the confidence of someone who held all the cards: the suburban house, primary custody of their daughter, and a significant portion of the assets he had quietly built. She had already secured a suite at a luxury hotel downtown, a temporary base for her new life with her manager, Julian. Mark didn't respond with the emotional outburst she expected. Instead, he pulled up a terminal interface on his own phone, the code scrolling in a blur of green against black. He had known about the regional project for 21 days. He had watched as Elena mistakenly synced her work device to their encrypted home backup server, thinking it was a simple charging dock. In that sync, she had surrendered her secrets: the hotel receipts, the flight itineraries, and the messages detailing how she planned to drain their joint accounts before the filing. With a few precise taps, Mark initiated a series of protocols he had spent the last 3 nights preparing. He didn't just target her phone, he targeted the infrastructure of her new reality. A remote wipe command was sent to her device, instantly scrubbing the evidence of her affair before she could use it for leverage. Simultaneously, an automated script began uploading a curated zip file of her project logs to the corporate ethics portal of her employer. As Mark stood to leave, the silence was his greatest weapon. He didn't need to explain that the smart locks on their home had already been updated to revoke her access, or that the joint accounts she thought she had emptied were actually protected by a secondary security layer she never knew existed. He simply walked toward the exit, leaving her in a restaurant where she could no longer afford the bill, clutching a phone that was rapidly turning into an expensive, empty brick. The transition from a quiet suburban home to the high-rise marble of the downtown Marriott was supposed to be Elena's victory lap. As she stepped out of her rideshare, she clutched her phone, but the device remained a black mirror, unresponsive to her touch. The remote wipe Mark had initiated during dinner had left her digitally stranded, severed from her contacts, her calendar, and the private messages she used to coordinate her life. She walked through the revolving doors with practice poise, heading straight for the check-in desk. Julian had promised her that room 402 was booked under his corporate account, a suite they had shared many times under the guise of regional strategy meetings. However, when the receptionist swiped the corporate card on file, the machine emitted a sharp, final beep. The red light on the card reader flickered like a warning sign. The receptionist's professional smile faltered as she looked at the screen. The corporate account had been flagged for suspicious activity and was frozen pending an internal audit. At that same moment, Julian emerged from the elevators, his face a ghostly shade of gray. He wasn't carrying a glass of champagne. He was carrying his laptop and a stack of papers, his hands visibly shaking. The project logs Mark had sent to the ethics portal had traveled faster than Elena could drive across town. Julian's private office had been locked down minutes after the gala dinner ended. The company's HR department had already revoked his spending privileges and suspended his access to all corporate systems. The power couple was suddenly standing in a public lobby, unable to pay for the room that was supposed to be their sanctuary, Julian's eyes darted around the lobby, avoiding Elena's gaze. He wasn't a partner anymore. He was a man in survival mode. Realizing that his high-paying career was evaporating because of the clueless husband he had mocked, he whispered frantically about legal counsel and non-disclosure agreements, but Elena wasn't listening. She was looking at her dead phone, realizing that every bridge she had built was currently on fire. While they argued in the lobby, a secondary notification triggered on Julian's laptop, a final gift from Mark's automated script. It was a copy of the deed to the suburban house, clearly showing that the property had been transferred into a protected family trust years ago. Elena had spent months planning how to take the house in the divorce, but the digital records now showed she was never a legal stakeholder. She had moved her things out of a home she didn't own, into a life she could no longer afford. By the time the sun began to rise over the city, the adrenaline of betrayal had been replaced by a cold, sharp desperation. Elena sat in the corner of a 24-hour diner across from the hotel, her expensive designer bag resting on a cheap laminate table. Julian was gone. He had left 2 hours earlier after a panicked phone call from his own wife. Realizing that the ethics report had not only hit his HR department, but had also been BC'd to his personal family email, Elena finally managed to borrow a charger from the diner's waiter. When her phone finally flickered back to life, it was empty. The factory reset had done its job perfectly. No photos of Lily, no saved passwords, and no evidence of her professional network. She sat in the glow of the sterile screen, trying to remember the login for her primary bank account, when she finally accessed her portal through the diner's guest Wi-Fi. The screen didn't show the $40,000 she had spent months skimming into a secret savings account. Instead, the balance read exactly zero. Beside the transaction history was a single line item: funds transferred to escrow, pending legal review. Mark had not stolen the money. As a programmer with a deep understanding of fintech protocols, he had flagged the transfers as unauthorized restructuring of marital assets through a preset digital alert. Because the money had been moved from a joint account to a private one shortly before a divorce filing, the bank's fraud algorithm, triggered by Mark's formal flag, had automatically locked the funds in a neutral escrow account. She couldn't touch a cent without a court order, a process that would take months and require her to explain the source of the money to a judge. Desperate for a win, Elena drove back to the suburban house as the first commuters were hitting the road. She expected to see her key work, or perhaps to find Mark waiting to beg for a reconciliation. Instead, the driveway was empty. When she reached for the smart lock on the front door, her fingerprint was rejected. The small LED light on the handle pulsed red, a silent no from the system Mark had built. She peered through the window of the living room. The house looked exactly the same, yet entirely foreign. On the coffee table sat a single folder, placed perfectly in the center where she couldn't miss it. It was the manual for property access. Beside it was a printed copy of the trust agreement she had ignored for a decade. The house wasn't an asset to be split. It was a sanctuary protected for their daughter, Lily, with Mark as the sole executor. By moving her belongings out voluntarily the night before, she had legally abandoned her residency. The silence of the neighborhood was broken only by the sound of her own heavy breathing. For years, she had viewed Mark's technical skills as a hobby, something he did to pass the time while she did the real work of socializing and selling. Now, she realized that while she had been playing a game of social chess, Mark had been rewriting the very rules of the board they were playing on. The morning sun did not bring clarity for Elena. It brought the cold, hard realization that a digital footprint is permanent. She sat in her car in the parking lot of her regional office, staring at the glass-fronted building that had been her second home for 7 years. In her mind, she was still the top-tier sales representative who had closed the tri-state contract. In reality, she was a liability. When she finally approached the entrance, the first sign of her new status was the silence of the electronic reader. She pressed her badge against the sensor once, twice, 5 times. The familiar green light stayed dark. The heavy magnetic lock remained engaged. Through the glass, she saw the receptionist, a woman she had shared coffee with every Monday, look up and then quickly look away, picking up a desk phone to call security. A few minutes later, the double doors opened just wide enough for a security guard to slide a single cardboard box through the gap. He didn't speak. He didn't offer a polite smile. He simply placed the box on the pavement and stepped back inside. On top of the box was a formal letter in a blue folder. Elena opened it with trembling hands. It wasn't just a termination notice. It was a for-cause dismissal. The letter was clinical. It cited a comprehensive internal audit triggered by an anonymous report that had provided high-resolution documentation of her activities. The company had tracked her corporate credit card usage against GPS logs from her company car. The data showed a 98% correlation between regional client dinners and Julian's personal travel schedule. Even more damaging were the records Mark had recovered from the home server. Internal strategy memos she had shared with Julian to help him look better to the board, a clear breach of confidentiality that bordered on corporate espionage. Elena retreated to her car, the weight of the box on the passenger seat feeling like an anchor. She attempted to call Julian, but his number had been disconnected. She tried his personal email, only to receive an automated address not found bounce back. He had scrubbed his digital existence the moment the HR department confronted him, likely in a desperate attempt to save his own pension. Leaving her to face the wreckage alone, she spent the afternoon in a quiet corner of a public library, the only place she could find free Wi-Fi and a sense of anonymity. She began reaching out to her network, the doctors, clinic managers, and headhunters who had spent years praising her drive. The shift in tone was instantaneous. In the world of pharmaceutical sales, reputation is the only currency that matters. By 2 p.m., she realized the project logs Mark had leaked had already circulated through the industry grapevine. One recruiter, a man she had helped place in a high-paying role 2 years prior, was the only one honest enough to take her call. "Elena," he said, his voice hushed, "I can't help you. The file that went out, it's not just about the affair. It's the data manipulation. The report shows you are using proprietary sales algorithms to mask your personal time off. No firm in the country will touch you with an ethics violation like that on your record. You're not just out at your firm, you're out of the industry." She hung up, the silence of the library pressing in on her. She realized then that Mark hadn't just changed the locks on their house, he had changed the locks on her future. As a programmer, he understood that a career is built on a series of permissions and trust protocols. By exposing the truth, he hadn't attacked her, he had simply revoked her admin access to the professional world she had manipulated for so long. As the library began to close, Elena found herself looking at her bank app again. The balance was still zero. The escrow lock was absolute. She had $85 in her purse and a car that would be repossessed by the company within 4 to 48 hours. She looked at the framed photo of Lily that had been at the top of her desk box. For years, she had told herself that she was doing all of this for Lily, that her climb was for her daughter's future. But looking at the cold, hard data of her own choices, she saw the truth. She hadn't been building a future. She had been burning the foundation for a momentary rush of power. She drove to a cheap motel on the outskirts of town, the kind of place she used to mock from the window of her luxury SUV as she checked in, paying cash for a single night. The clerk didn't ask for her autograph or a sales pitch. He didn't care about her energy or her vision. He just wanted to see a valid ID. Elena realized that for the first time in her adult life, she was no longer a queen of sales. She was just another person in a room, stripped of her titles, her technology, and her home, waiting for a tomorrow that held no promises. The final chapter of this dissolution was not a sudden explosion, but a slow, quiet settling of dust. 6 months had passed since the night at the Italian restaurant, and the transition from a shared life to 2 separate realities was now complete. The legal system, much like the computer code Mark lived by, had processed the data and reached its final output. For Elena, the passage of time had been a lesson in the friction of reality. She sat in her new residence, a 1-bedroom apartment in a complex where the walls were thin enough to hear her neighbor's television, and the view was of a parking lot rather than the city skyline. Gone were the high-ceilinged rooms of the suburban house, the smart integrated climate control, and the professional cleaning services that had allowed her to focus entirely on her brand. Her daily life was now a series of manual chores and tight budgets. Her new job as a junior administrator at a local medical clinic was a constant reminder of how far she had fallen. She spent her days filing paperwork and answering phones for doctors she used to sell to as an equal. The pharmaceutical industry had closed its doors to her with a finality that was absolute. In the age of digital background checks, the for-cause termination from her previous firm was a permanent red flag. Every interview she had managed to land ended the same way: a polite email citing a mismatch in corporate values. The divorce settlement had been the final blow to her ego. Mark's preparation had been flawless. During the mediation, his lawyer had produced a digital ledger not of her affair, but of the marital assets. Mark had documented every dollar he had contributed to the household since Lily was born, contrasted against the $40,000 Elena had attempted to skim into offshore accounts. The judge, seeing the clear intent to defraud the marital estate, had ruled with surgical precision. The family home, the ultimate symbol of their life together, was placed into a protective family trust for the sole benefit of their daughter, Lily. Mark was appointed the trustee. Elena was granted her personal belongings and a small, one-time equalization payment, most of which was immediately swallowed by the legal fees she had incurred trying to fight the digital fortress Mark had built. She had walked into the marriage thinking she was the one building the empire, only to realize she was a tenant in a structure Mark had owned from the start. On a Tuesday afternoon, Mark stood in the kitchen of the suburban house, preparing Lily's favorite dinner. The house was quiet, save for the low hum of the server he still maintained in the basement. He had been promoted to lead security architect at his firm, a role that recognized his ability to anticipate threats before they materialized. His life was simpler now, stripped of the constant gaslighting and the subtle belittling that had characterized his final years with Elena. He looked at his tablet, which displayed the home's security dashboard. A notification appeared. Visitor detected. Elena, it was time for the midweek visitation. Mark didn't feel the surge of anger he once might have. Instead, he felt a profound sense of closure. He watched on the high-definition monitor as Elena walked up the driveway. She wasn't wearing the designer blazer or the 5-inch heels. She was wearing a simple coat and sensible shoes, her shoulders slightly slumped. She no longer had a key. She no longer had a biometric code. She stood on the porch and pressed the doorbell, waiting for permission to enter the world she had once claimed to run. Mark opened the door. He didn't invite her in. He didn't need to. Lily was already at the door, her backpack ready. "Hi, Lily," Elena said, her voice lacking its old theatrical projection. It was just the voice of a mother who was tired. "I'll have her back by 7 p.m., Elena said, looking at Mark. For the first time, she wasn't looking through him. She was looking at him with a mixture of fear and newfound respect. She finally saw the boring programmer for what he was, the architect of her survival and her downfall. 7 p.m. is fine," Mark replied. He didn't add any extra words. He didn't need to gloat. The results spoke for themselves. As they drove away, Mark returned to the kitchen. He checked the smart lock logs, ensuring the door had engaged. He then opened a small encrypted file on his laptop, the one that contained the project logs he had used to protect his daughter's future. With a single keystroke, he selected the entire directory and hit delete. He didn't need the evidence anymore. The system was clean. The test run was over, and the real life, the one built on truth, stability, and character, was just beginning. He sat down at the table with his own dinner, a man who had successfully defended his home not with a loud voice, but with a silent, unbreakable code. Elena, meanwhile, caught a glimpse of the house in her rearview mirror as she turned the corner. The lights were warm, the structure was solid, and the man inside was exactly where he belonged. She realized then that Mark hadn't hacked her life. He had simply allowed her own actions to create their natural consequences. He hadn't destroyed her. He had just stopped saving her from herself. And in the silence of the car, with Lily humming a song in the back seat, Elena finally understood that the most dangerous person to betray is the one who quietly builds the world you live in.